Quick apology for the quality of my audio in this upcoming podcast. Over years of podcasting, you think you've encountered every possible way that something can go wrong with the audio in your recording, and then sometimes you find a new one. So don't worry, we found another way to screw up our audio, and we won't do it again, but we did our best to clean this up. If it's too annoying to you, go ahead, delete it, and move on. But I think that you can still actually get something solid out of this episode, so enjoy it. Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.
Over the years, we've seen many different movement practices sort of being used within the CrossFit world, and especially in competitive fitness, because what we find is these people have extra training time and they want to put in the extra work into their training. And quite a lot of the time, people are aware of movement economy and understanding the idea of being more efficient. And quite often we see that people find it difficult to get into certain positions in the sport, whether that would be a squat, whether that would be going overhead, or whether that might be doing something a little bit more nuanced, like a single arm overhead squat. And what they try to do is they try to go through some various different movement practices to cultivate new positions and then be able to practice that within their training and be able to add intensity onto that. We've seen, this idea of going through, long duration stretching. We see what's quite popular, people going through what you would consider more sort of like yoga pose type stretches pre or post session. We see now a lot of people doing more movement flows. And as well as that, we see people starting to understand how you can use things like breathing, which aren't necessarily hitting the targeted area that they're trying to improve directly, but how we can manipulate things like that and tension to improve movement. And what we're going to discuss today is how we can improve movement, some of the things that we want to consider for someone who's involved in competitive CrossFit. As a sport, it demands a lot of the body in very, very similar patterns. And then we're going to frame the conversation a little bit around the overhead movement, whether that's going shoulders overhead with a barbell, whether that's holding a barbell overhead for some overhead squats, or whether that's going to be going overhead with another implement. This is a movement pattern that's required a lot in the sport, whether you are pushing weight overhead or whether you're hanging from a pull-up bar or a pair of rings. So Todd, what do you see with people trying to help their overhead position or help their movement in general? And what's some of the things that you've helped other people work on with that?
Sure. So, with overhead mobility, I mean, that's a common movement problem that a lot of folks have, right? They notice it trying to snatch. They notice it trying to do any sort of barbell shoulder to overhead. They notice it, on their kip with ring muscle ups or pull-ups or something like that. They notice it trying to get into some sort of handstand position, or particularly in handstand walking, where they end up just arching the shit out of their back and hooking their feet over, right? I mean, these are all areas where people are like, okay, something's going on, and I potentially have some sort of restriction in shoulder mobility, and I would like to improve that. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of solutions that people have kind of gravitated towards in the market. And, I don't want to cast aspersions on any of these solutions, because I think there's value in most of them, at least some of the time, right? That people have, like you said, been doing a lot of mobility work with kind of static stretching based activities like ROMWOD or yoga or any of the sort of like ROMWOD ripoffs, right? That a lot of those paradigms have a lot of shoulder mobility built into them. That, Kelly Starrett kind of introduced the CrossFit community as a whole to this idea of like, hey, grab a lacrosse ball, spend some time rolling around on it. You can get a band, do a little bit of band distracted stretching, etc. And that there's also, the entire manual therapy paradigm as well, where a lot of athletes have a local chiropractor or massage therapist or physical therapist, and they go in, they're like, yeah, I need to get some body work done, etc. And again, there's value in a lot of these things. And I can certainly think of, specific times that I've recommended pretty much each of these modalities to someone for some reason. But Luke, like you said, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to make these things part of like an integrated pathway for someone to actually improve their specific movement issue. And, as usual on this podcast, people are kind of interested in a simple solution to a simple problem, right? It's like, oh, I have a hard time putting my arms over my head. Therefore, I have a shoulder mobility problem. How do I fix my shoulder mobility problem? Well, if I can't put my arms over my head, my shoulders must be tight. How do I loosen my shoulders? I hammer them with a Theragun. Great, problem solved, right? People want something simple. They want something that, they've seen a famous athlete posting about on Instagram, and they're perfectly happy to settle for a good enough solution, right? It's like, okay, this seems to kind of work. I can do this and at least get through my training sessions. And it sort of aligns with my existing paradigm of how, tight muscles work. Sign me up, I'm in. And, there's certainly plenty of people who are kind of making do with that and doing okay. As coaches who maybe have a more, let's say, deeper interest in how these things actually work, that can be super frustrating because you're like, listen, like, this is just not how it actually works. The problem for you putting your arms over your head is not the fact that you're not doing enough raw mod, it's that you have no scapular motor control. I mean, people just don't want to hear it. They're not interested in rebuilding their entire framework for how movement works in order to understand the nuances of motor control and length tension relationships and the nervous system's role in creating certain elements of like protective tightness and the difference between active and passive range of motion. People are not going to want to build that framework to learn how they could potentially better improve their mobility, especially when they have like a good enough solution of like, I have someone who does my body work, I hammer myself with a Theragun, I have this band drill, like we're good to go. But, for people who do want to potentially learn more and to pick this apart a little bit, that's what we're here for. So particularly with the overhead stuff, right? I mean, we kind of decided to focus the conversation on that since that seems to be a common problem for people. This is an area where we can really see the difference between what is often really happening for people versus what they think is happening, right? So again, people are sort of happy to settle for good enough, but if you're like, you know what, I really do actually want to figure this out, we can sort of try to pick apart this specific scenario a little bit more, which I do think we may have done before on the podcast. But let's say someone is having a hard time, an intermediate level CrossFit competitor who can do most movements RX, has kind of like a sketchy overhead squat snatch position, but they can get it done. They arch their back too much on handstand push-ups, and they have to do like some weird grip stuff to properly lock out push jerks overhead. Sure, right? Sounds like someone who we probably all know. In let's say like 90% of cases, this person is thinking like, okay, I'm lacking thoracic extension. I need to improve my T-spine mobility and my shoulders are tight, right? In some cases that's true, but a lot of times what's actually going on for this individual is that they have a combination of lack of mobility in the T-spine, but often because they're locked in extension rather than they don't have the ability to create extension. And then they have just absolutely terrible scapular motor control. So even though their shoulders may have enough range of motion as far as the ability to create flexion and go overhead, they're unable to move the scapula to get the entire shoulder complex in the proper position to create a solid overhead lockout, right? So what's going on for this individual, let's start with the T-spine, right? They think that they're lacking thoracic extension because they feel like their upper back is locked up and that they can't get more extension as they try to go overhead. And what's really happening for them most of the time, you can see this in tons of elite CrossFit athletes, is that they have this flared rib position, right? Where their upper back is actually locked in an extended position all the time, and their rib cage is flared up, right? Sort of creating that open scissor type of look between their pelvis and their rib cage. And so when they try to go overhead and create more extension, they're already at pretty much end range extension for their joints. And so they can't get any more, right? I've used the analogy in the past of a door that's already open and you're trying to open it more, right? It's like, yo, this door is open and it's pressed against the wall over here and you're trying to open it more. Like, you don't need to like knock the wall out in order to open the door more. What you need what you need to do if you want to create relative opening is actually close the door a little bit, right? So if the rib cage comes down and we sort of reduce that open scissor position of the rib cage flared up, is, that gets more level with the pelvis. So then you can actually create relative extension when you need it, which then allows the scapula to move on the rib cage and create a solid overhead position, right? So again, in a huge number of cases, not all of them, there's plenty of edge cases where something weird is going on. People have actual structural issues. Some people have, there's all kinds of weird ways that the scapula can be locked into certain places, motor control issues, et cetera. But let's say the sort of par for the course standard thing is someone who's like, my upper back is tight, I don't have thoracic extension, I have shitty shoulder mobility. And if you just kind of assess them briefly, you're like, cool. Actually, what's happening is your rib cage is flared an unbelievable amount, and you have no ability to get that rib cage down, create relative extension, then move the scapula on the rib cage such that you can actually elevate the entire shoulder complex and get overhead, right? And so that can be a little bit difficult to speak through, I suppose. I'm not sure if that actually makes any sense to those listening, but that's an example where as a coach, you're like, okay, what you think is happening is not what's happening at all. If you trust me enough to actually listen to me, we can potentially fix this. But a lot of times people, again, they just are like, you know what, I'm just going to stick with Realmod because I see Tia doing it on Instagram and I spent $300 on this Theragun. So like, that's what we're going to do. But hopefully some folks are like, okay, maybe I do actually want to improve this. So what we're thinking about doing with improving, movement quality is not just this idea of like, oh, this is tight, so it needs to either be stretched or like hammered with something, right? Yes, there is value in stretching. There is value in this kind of like self-applied manual therapy or manual therapy from a professional. But really what's restricting people in most of these scenarios is the ability for their brain to properly map where their joints are in space and to control those ranges of motion, right? That as, creatures existing in the world, our brain essentially has a map of all these kinds of different movements that it wants to do. And then it utilizes our joints to create those movements. And it's really willing to just compensate and figure something out, right? I mean, everyone has probably sprained their ankle or done something at some point, and they don't even have to think about it, but they just automatically move into doing some sort of crazy limp to get around, right? Because on a subconscious level, your nervous system recognizes something is altered and wrong with this joint over here. We want to create this walking pattern. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to sort of like not move this joint so much and just swing the leg around, and we can get to where we need to go, right? And we see the same thing all the time with people trying to go overhead. It's like, you know what? The rib cage is not really where it belongs. The shoulders are, the scapula aren't really doing what we want them to. So instead, we're just going to kind of like create this alternate pattern to get where we want to go. So in terms of improving movement quality, what we're really trying to do through all these different tools and modalities that we've discussed is improve the nervous system's subconscious control of how it attempts to achieve different ranges of motion and how it attempts to use those ranges of motion in order to create specific movement patterns that we want. And in a sport like CrossFit, we have this huge problem of like, okay, cool. If we can even convince you that that's a good idea and that it's worth your time to work on that, and we maybe make some progress with having you do, I don't know, like bottoms up kettlebell drills and foam roller wall slides and maybe some like weird breathing exercises where you're trying to keep your rib cage down. It's like, okay, cool. This is doing great. Your scapula are doing what they're supposed to. Now row 2,000 meters, do 300 double unders, do 50 wall balls, and try to do a bunch of squat snatches. Then guess what? Even if you're really good at crawling and breathing in a non-fatigue state, when you are exhausted and you sort of fatigued all the stabilizing musculature in your upper back, and you have a default pattern that you've been doing for 5 years before you even learn any of this stuff, it's not so easy to just jump into doing things the correct way at that point. So this is a huge problem and something that I don't necessarily have a solution for. But in terms of thinking about trying to improve movement quality, specifically for overhead stuff, we have this let's say, two-headed challenge of getting athletes to even understand and buy into the idea of having a more nuanced and less simplified version of how movement and motor control works, and then bridging the gap between, great, we have these, mobility drills and corrective exercises that you can do, and trying to get that to actually translate into any sort of performance-based scenario, which is shockingly difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I know that I've had personal experience with this. I know you text me once and you were telling me about the door is already open and you're trying to jam it even further open. I think for me personally, one of the things I had quite a lot of difficulty with, and I sort of still have to be careful with my thinking around movement, is sometimes you don't feel these drills, you don't feel these exercises. And I think that people almost they expect that there needs to be this feeling of something being stretched, something being released, and there almost needs to be this instant kinesthetic feedback from whatever they're doing, and I think that one of the things, an easy example for me was I used to do glute band walks and then I'd squat and it felt better. So all of a sudden I'm like, yeah, this is what I need to be doing every single day. I think that there's definitely some concepts like test, retest, which are definitely going to be helpful in those situations. And I think that it's really important that people are, they're learning from folks like Kelly and, the people who are putting out useful information out there. But at the same time, you've got to be careful with the dogma that does surround the sort of movement world and the different practices that people go through. But yeah, I definitely understand that sort of battle. First off, as an athlete, I've experienced, going through things and not really understanding what's going on too much. But at the same time, with athletes, I think it's trying to sort of develop maybe some good habits and just good behaviors from the get-go. So, okay, doing a proper thorough warm-up, making sure that, you're not necessarily expecting your movement to just become fixed after doing 2 minutes of a certain drill, before you get into it. It's something that has to happen over a long period of time. It almost needs to also happen throughout your session. I think, like for instance, I remember watching people who used to get coached by James Jousey, and I noticed that they were constantly in between sets doing different movement drills, and they were going back to it. And I remember at the time I had this sort of thinking of, well, you save that for the end of the session, or you save that for the beginning of the session. But it's this constant process that has to be going on. And I think that there are certain things like ROMWOD and those daily movement practice type those applications and those things that you can subscribe to. I think that they are beneficial in the fact that they get people into the habit and the routine of doing it. But at the same time, it's sort of there is definitely this, they I don't know. I'm yet to see a really, really tight individual who's a bad mover and also an elite CrossFit athlete who is also promoting one of these products. Like everyone who is promoting these products, their squat looks great, their overhead position looks great. They tend to do really, really well through technical movements, right? And I think people have to be a little bit more critical about what they're taking in, but at the same time taking what they can from these things. And I think one of the things I remember, and I know Kelly Starrett still says it, but he says that people should be able to handle their own bodies and do something every day to perform maintenance of some sort. And I think that it's really, really important that people can sort of understand that. And that may need to actually just be something that they do in a warm up. It may be something that they do during their cool down. It could be something that they do whilst watching TV. But, I remember as well, there was like a video and Matt Fraser was just talking about how he would just be doing, he would get his partner to be doing a Graston on him, every single time they were watching TV and things like that. And these types of things, the further you do get into the sport, you do have people who are just tend to be pretty good and they tend to just, be able to warm up within 10 minutes and then just get into their session and then, constantly be able to move pretty well. But at the same time, there's definitely certain demands of the sport which aren't necessarily healthy as well, and I think people have a bit of a warped reality where because they are doing this fitness activity every single day that they are quote unquote going to be healthier, but you are putting yourself under a lot of tax, under a lot of stress. It's very taxing on the body. And I think one of the things I notice is that I think movement variation is something as well which can really, really help, especially as people get a lot more experienced in the sport, and they have to, they have to challenge themselves through the same movement patterns in different ways over a long period of time. And I think this is where, say, for instance, the popularity of functional bodybuilding is quite good as well, is because people are actually starting to go through movements that they've typically done for years and years and years, and they don't necessarily get the same feelings because they're going with their body. But I do think that there's a fine line between having to do like what you need for the sport, and then as well as that, making sure that you're staying healthy, you're avoiding injury, because injury is going to be it's the easiest way to reduce consistent adaptation over time. And as well as that, trying to make these micro improvements of helping out with movement. It is something that just doesn't happen the same way as adding 20 kilos onto your back squat. You've got to be able to sort of take your small wins. It's about noticing whether, a certain movement in a certain workout felt a little bit better. It's certain things like that which are really, really going to be helpful. And you'll notice, well, I'd say actually you probably wouldn't notice over time. I think one of the things with improvements in movement is that because you're not necessarily, if you improve your mobility, you might be able to all of a sudden lift a new number in a certain movement or something like that. I do think that there's definitely those direct performance gains that you can get from improving your movement. But I think there's a lot more sort of nuanced stuff going on with improving your movement. It's probably going to be, you notice that you're potentially not as sore in certain areas after some heavy training days. It might be that you're able to go 4 or 5 weeks on the bounce of, tough training weeks before you have to take a deload, whereas before you felt like you had to after, say, 2 weeks. It could be that all of a sudden you feel comfortable going overhead 4 times a week compared to going overhead 3 times a week. And I think that these are things that, I've definitely played around with in my own training. And I also try to get the people that I coach to communicate with me as much as possible on this type of stuff. And it's quite difficult as well to coach at a distance, the movement work. But I do think that sort of trying to base things off of some solid behaviors at the start, and just whether it's just looking at it like, okay, I'm going to do this daily. I'm not going to expect this to be fixing this, that, and the other straight away, and also just understanding that you may not actually feel the change or the difference in your movement straight away. It might not be a light bulb moment. It might not be a new PB on a certain lift or a certain movement. It might just be over time you're able to withstand a lot more. But going back to one of the things you were saying about the sort of compensation, I think that there also needs to be an acceptance that there's always going to be some element of that going on. And I remember when we had the podcast with James, Jousey, and Phil on, and I think I forget which one, but one of the guys, they said that the best athletes are the best compensators, and we see this with a lot of elite athletes who they don't necessarily move well, and and I think that people have sort of
and keep in mind that we're talking about someone who coaches Sam Briggs.
Yeah, but the thing is,
not to put her on blast, but right, that's a perfect example.
Yeah, but like there is an element of like, okay, the sport is about getting the task done, and doing so, and trying to but at the top of the game, you've got to understand that these people are putting their bodies at risk a lot more, and this is probably something that you wouldn't necessarily expect from someone who is just getting into the sport. I know, for instance, I think I remember speaking to someone, and they were saying that the CrossFit Games in the teens division, they have essentially like a floating head judge who goes around and literally is saying, your movement is getting ropey, you need to fix it up, get your technique better, otherwise we're going to pull you out. That type of situation going on, which is very similar to youth weightlifting, where they're actually scored on their movement as opposed to the weights, because that's obviously going to help with longevity, and that's, creating a good mindset around it. But getting back to the point, but I think that, most people will develop compensations. And I think this idea of trying to perfect movement, sometimes it stalls progress, because I think some people, I know that I coach, I've coached people who they feel like they shouldn't do something because they can't move a certain way or the way that they want to. But we are completely different as individuals, and I think another point as well is just, this sort of assumption that someone can put a barbell over their head, someone can squat, squat to sort of depth, and they can sort of pull together all of the what we could say is like the minimum standard movements, and they can do so efficiently. That doesn't necessarily mean that they move well. And I think there's quite a common misconception is like, oh, that person has like their elbows really high in their front rack and they squat really deep and their butts touching their ankles. That means they move well. And it's like, okay, it doesn't necessarily work like that. I think people have got to understand that you've got to be strong, and you've got to be able to you've got to be able to do these movements under a lot of duress. And just because you can hold a certain position doesn't mean that you can, get into it or move out of it particularly well. I think that's one of the things that people, they just try to focus on. Okay, what was my bottom position, or what was my receiving position look like? What was my, I can get the barbell over my head. Let's bring it back to the shoulder to overhead example. That means I move well. I can do it. I can do the task. But then we look at, say, for instance, their movement when they try, or the bar path when they go through a strict press, or how they connect their hip extension from a push press into their shoulder to overhead. And it's like, okay, well, this has just got, completely out of whack. So we have to go back. We have to teach it. We have to sort of almost relearn it. And I think that there is obviously a lot of educating that has to go on early in a person's training career. But, if you have a good amount of experience in this, and I think that if you do get told something which you're maybe initially resistant to in terms of improving your movement, you've got to sort of, ask yourself, why are you resistant to that? Is it because you've spent, like you said, Todd, $300 on a Theragun? Are you resistant to it because you go through something that your favorite athletes go through, and you feel that that's what you need? And I know we've spoken about this before, but there is a whole market out there now for recovery and movement and optimization within performance. And these things aren't necessarily the be all and end all. The basics done really, really well over a long period of time is what is going to help people, most of all. But that is obviously, not what people want to hear a lot of the time.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good stuff in there that I want to touch on. But I think that potentially the most useful framing for folks trying to think about, okay, well, what should I actually do to improve my overhead positioning, right? I mean, we talked before just about some of the specific ideas surrounding, improving scapular motor control, keeping the rib cage down, learning to create upper rotation in the scapula so that you actually have the right positioning to be in a good lockout spot, right? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff like that. You can start searching around. Eric Cressy has a ton of excellent information on that. Tony Gentlecore, like a bunch of folks in that more sort of strength and conditioning sphere. I know before you were talking about CARs, right? Controlled articular rotations put out there by the FRC folks, right? I mean, all that stuff is really, really good and valuable. But I think that the way that you were talking about the idea of, improving this stuff doesn't necessarily result in a sudden, immediate jump in numbers is really, really important, right? I mean, we've talked about this before through the lens of conditioning, where, say you have someone who really struggles with conditioning pieces, who feels like their engine isn't there or their aerobic capacity isn't there, and a lot of the times what they want to do is just start doing rowing intervals and assault bike intervals and going for runs and be like, oh, is it cool if I buy a weight vest and do extra running with a weight vest on my off days? And it's like, well, I mean, maybe, but it's not like suddenly you're going to do some running intervals with a weight vest and improve your ability to do thrusters and double unders. It's not that simple. But by improving your overall aerobic capacity, you can improve your ability to recover between sessions. You can improve your ability to recover during sessions. You can improve your ability to potentially make sessions more sustainable by having less of the energy required to get through the session come from unsustainable methods. Like all of these things are part of the process. And it's like, okay, you're sort of making, you're removing glass ceilings, right? Where it's like, you're going to potentially just get stuck at a certain point if your movement quality is bad and you're not an elite compensator, as you mentioned. So if you can remove those glass ceilings, you're potentially going to see more improvement over time. And you're also, like you said before as well, potentially going to see the ability to do more work over time because you're not chewing yourself up every single session because you can't get your shoulders where they belong, right? So I think that that's a really important way to frame this discussion and think about it. Again, rather than like, oh, great, like we got your scapula to do what we want them to, and all of a sudden you set a 30-pound PR on your snatch. Yeah, it's just not going to happen. But if you improve your scapular positioning and you can do, 6 months of solid technique drills where your shoulders are where they belong, and then you can slowly build up into actually being able to maintain that position with solid weight, at some point you may hit a PR that you wouldn't have otherwise hit, or you may be able to hit a heavy-ish weight in a fatigue scenario that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to hit. So it's difficult to see the exact like, oh, this happened and then here's the result. But it doesn't mean that it's not super, super valuable. So, we sort of danced around this topic a little bit, but in terms of actually making these changes, I don't know what the right word is. Let's say applicable, right? Where it's like, okay, this is going to actually show up in your training. This is going to show up when you are attempting to lift heavy. This is going to show up at the end of some snatch ladder where you have to hit some relatively high percentage of your 1 rep max and your overhead position used to be shit. And now it's good enough that you can actually, hit this lift when you're tired. Like I said, that's a really, really difficult, let's say, like terrain to traverse, right? To make the transition from a bottoms up kettlebell drill into a 95% of 1RM snatch in a fatigue state. How do you get that shoulder position to translate? And I think that a useful way to think about it is not just through these drills, not just through these specific stretching pieces. Again, even though all these different things have value, it's to think about, like you said, that some of Jousty's athletes are doing. It's like, okay, in training, can you do these drills and then immediately apply them to some type of lifting scenario, right? Okay, that's a simple way to start to get this going. Let's do these foam roller wall slides, and then let's have you do some type of technique-focused snatch drill and see if you can carry over the feeling of reaching through your scapula from the foam roller wall slide directly into doing some type of, tall snatch drill. Can you do that? Can you feel it? Yes. If so, let's try something a little bit more advanced. And then you can just sort of progress it over time to actually being able to carry that feeling over into more and more difficult scenarios, similar to what we've talked about in the past with, okay, cool, you can do strict handstand push-ups in an EMOM scenario with no other interfering movements. Now you can do them in a scenario where you're coming off of an assault bike sprint where you're kind of out of breath, but you haven't really been doing something that's going to fatigue your shoulders that much. Now you can do them when they're paired with double unders, which creates a little bit of tension through the rotator cuff. Now you can do them coming out of wall balls, which is, a conditioning fatigue coupled with specific, pressing muscle endurance fatigue. And now you can do it in a 20-minute AMRAP of thrusters, heavy squat cleans, and, something else terrible, handstand walking. I don't know, like just the stupidest possible way to do strict handstand push-ups, right? And there's this idea of progressing the ability to do something in a favorable scenario to the ability to do something in a totally chaotic, ridiculous, unfavorable scenario. And I think we're looking at a similar progression for actually nailing movement quality, right? Is that we expect people to be able to do drills in a non-fatigue scenario with a lot of thought and coaching and understanding that exactly what they're supposed to be feeling, and then trying to walk them through, okay, cool, what's the next step? It looks like this. Great, you're able to check that box. Now, can you do these drills warming up for some sort of scenario in which you're going to be fatigued? Does that translate over? And ideally, again, over a much longer time than anybody ever wants it to take, hopefully that does actually result in long-term change in movement quality, particularly in more sporting-based scenarios.
Yeah, I think The issue is, and this is something we speak about a lot, whether it is improving your strength, your conditioning, getting better at the sport, whatever it is, it's like it's not going to happen over a short period of time through just intense exposure. And I think that people are after the warm-up drills that they do for the rest of their life, the strength drills that they do for the rest of their life. They're sort of looking for that, the sort of the system or the process that they go through, and they just rinse and repeat. And as much as people feel that that is honestly, I haven't seen it exist in sort of all of the reading and looking at the different sort of training that I've looked at within endurance sports and strength sports and within CrossFit as well. And you may have to look at things from a little bit more of like, okay, what are the problems I had 3 months ago? What are the problems I had 6 months ago? What are the problems I had 2 years ago? And looking at your development over time. And then that is probably going to be where you sort of see where these things notch up. And I do think that, if you are looking to improve your movement, it needs to be this conscious thing that you're going through in the session, whether you're doing sort of what you're describing of clusters, where you're going from the movement into a drill, into the movement into a drill. So you're having sort of that direct feedback, or, whether it's that you're doing this prep sequence, this cool down sequence, whatever it is, you've just got to be aware as well when you are on performing movements. I think quite a lot of the time people just think, okay, I do my warm up, I focus on my technique, I drill things a little bit at the beginning, and then as soon as I start putting weight onto the barbell, I'm just looking to get strong, or as soon as I start these intervals, I'm just looking to go fast. You've got to be conscious of these things as you're going through them. There's definitely I know that in the past, Todd, when you were coaching me, you would get me to do sort of like play and practice scenarios for like 20 minutes, and you'd throw in a skill movement, and you'd throw in a sort of like a movement based type thing, but having sort of that no pressure of training metrics or anything like that. Sometimes your body just needs that, and it just needs reps, and it needs time in doing what you're trying to progress. And it doesn't necessarily happen just from, doing 3x10 3 times a week for 3 months, right? It doesn't work like that.
It's all real. It's all real. It's the skill work, the sort of unstructured, like, hey, just mess around with this movement. That's, not the thing that people love doing. They want to do an EMOM, and they want to do something for time. Same idea of like, hey, the best thing for you to do to improve your snatch position might be to mess around with these drills in an unstructured way, and then put 40% of your 1 rep max on the barbell and just go back and forth between them without any specific program or structure. And people don't want to do that, but hopefully, just through the lens of understanding, like, okay, can we remove glass ceilings? Can we actually improve motor control and the sort of subconscious way that our brain decides to create certain movement patterns? Now, can we progress that through more and more challenging ways of expressing that movement? Hopefully that's enough to get folks on the right track to, improving their overhead position. Let's find out.
Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.